The parents of an autistic man living in a locked mental health unit say they've been battling for years to get him out.
He has a lot of strange thoughts and weird beliefs, but pretty harmless. And he's not an ex-murderer. His anger is really because of frustration, not because he really wants to hurt people.
He has, episodes of being a fabulous guy, and that's what he is most of the time. But he can misinterpret things and get quite angry with people, and he can strike out and what have you. And I think we can have an environment where he suffers a lot less frustrations and therefore is far less likely to display those kind of characteristics.
This is from 2016, from a case that horrified the country. An autistic, intellectually disabled man held in an institution for nearly 20 years, detained under the Mental Health Act. Deemed to be a high-risk patient, his parents spending years battling to have him released. 2 years later, Ashley Peacock was released from the cell-like room he was kept in for at least 23 hours a day, and now he's living in his own house by a river on the Kapiti coast. Surely we would never see a case like that again, would we?
The mother of an autistic man who's been locked up for nearly half of his life, she'll today argue in the Supreme Court that her son is being arbitrarily detained. The man, whose name is suppressed, has been held under the Intellectual Disability Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act for 18 years because he is considered too dangerous to release.
The Supreme Court has been told that an autistic and intellectually disabled man locked up for half his life may not be a danger to the public, as he's been made out to be.
How, within a legal framework, does one light a fire under the system because this guy's been in detention for 18 years?
Last week, the Supreme Court reserved its decision on the fate of a man known as Jay, whose mother says he's being arbitrarily detained and his human rights breached.
My first thought was it doesn't seem fair. My first thought was that there is no place for our autistic adults when they get to this point where they need greater support and they need greater supervision, but this doesn't seem right in the way they're going about this.
Kia ora, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, a case that is spookily similar to that of Ashley Peacock's 8 years ago. The balance between the risk to the public and the human rights of the intellectually disabled, and the law that allows us to detain someone who's been charged with no crime indefinitely. RNZ investigative journalist Anusha Bradley has been covering Jay's case. I asked her, how is this happening again?
That was exactly the question that I had that popped into my head when I got a call from someone in the disability sector just before Christmas, actually, saying, I think you need to look into the case of Jay. And they told me about what the situation was, and I really couldn't believe it. I thought, what? This guy's been locked up for 20 years. And the first thing I thought of was, well, that's what happened to Ashley Peacock. And I thought he was the last one. How is that still possible? And so that got me really intrigued as to what this case was about. There had been a few stories reported, just court stories really, about Jay's case. And
Jay's not his real name.
No, Jay is just the initial. We can't use his real name because it's suppressed by the court. We need to protect his identity. So, yeah, there'd been a few court stories done in, I think, 2022 when he was appearing before the High Court, but nothing really into his background and who he was and his family and his situation. So I managed to get hold of his mother. She had never told her story. And so I spent a day with her and her advocate, and she was a beautiful lady, soft and gentle, and I just struck how caring she was. And she loved her son so much. And really, Jay is a man who's in his 40s. He was diagnosed with autism quite early on, severe autism, about age 3 or 4. He was later diagnosed, I think, 8 or 9, with an intellectual disability as well. He went to a special school and he had behavioural challenges, but nothing serious. And because of his autism, he really didn't like loud noises. He used to wear headphones all the time. He particularly hated slamming doors. One day in his 20s, his mother said that the neighbours were slamming their doors this had been an issue, and they'd actually put in like sort of rubber strips around the doors to sort of help muffle the sound. But one day that noise really rattled him, and he went outside. His mother was saying that she was washing the dishes, and it was in the early evening, and normally she locks the doors. The door was open. He just went outside, he picked up an axe, and he smashed his neighbour's windows and the windows on his neighbour's car. And she went over and found him, and he had cut himself, but no one else was injured. The police were called, and he was charged with willful damage and, I think, trespassing on a property. And so began his foray into the criminal justice system. And it soon became quite apparent that he was unfit to stand trial because of his intellectual disability. And there's a special system which allows for people in this situation to be, I guess, processed through, if they offend, to be treated in the criminal justice system. So basically they're removed from the criminal justice system and they're assessed under the Intellectual Disability Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act.
So they sidestep the court processes that way.
Exactly. So officially, Jay has never been charged with anything because he's literally been taken out of the court process and he's never offended, so to speak. And while he's being assessed for this so-called crime, they decided that he posed a serious threat. He was quite violent. He drew pictures that were violent. He would make threats to kill people. And as a result of these assessments, Jay has been held under the Act as a care recipient for 18 years now. So it's interesting to note, and the arguments are that, you know, if he was an ordinary person who had committed this crime of smashing windows, the prison sentence would have been 4 months in jail or a $2,000 fine. Yet because he is intellectually disabled, he's been able to be held under this Act with no prospect of release.
When they say held, are there rules over the sort of institution that he goes to?
Absolutely.
Is it more prison than home?
So never prison. You are held in either a supervised care facility in the community or a secure hospital level facility.
Something like the Mason Clinic.
Yes, exactly. Now, Jay spent many years, 10 years in a supervised care facility, but then his behaviour deteriorated and he was moved to the Mason Clinic in 2020. The last 4 years, he's basically been kept in isolation, or what they call seclusion there. So he has 2 rooms, a lounge and a bathroom. He's monitored and looked after by 3 staff at all times, but he has no interaction with anyone, and that's largely due to his behaviour. So apparently he assaults staff, he kicks them, punches them, makes threats. His family and advocates argue that his behaviour is actually the result of his detention. And when I was talking to his mum, that was the big question, you know. Is this guy really dangerous, or is it the way he's been detained that's caused him to be like this? And you can't help but wonder, if I was locked up, I would probably be
acting
like
out
that
as well.
Yeah.
So when he gets reassessed for another, I mean, I presume there are finite years or number of time that he's, each time he's reassessed.
Yeah, so what happens is that the court places a person under this Act as a care recipient for 1 to 3 years, but they're reassessed by a psychologist or a psychiatrist every 6 months. And in Jay's case, it's just been extended. And the Act is quite specific in that a carer can be extended an unlimited amount of times. Wow. And that was a major issue in this court case.
The system is not holding out a torch of hope here.
That's Justice Williams at the Supreme Court hearing, questioning the level of rehabilitation offered to Jay and asking why there was no plan to transition him into the community.
Meanwhile, we've got someone in detention for 18 years with no real prospect of release. Seems to me at some point you reach a tipping point where stuff needs to change and resources need to be allocated because the oppression is unbearable.
It poses so many questions, this case, about how we treat disabled people, what value we place on their liberty. One of the main arguments in the court was the longer someone's detained, should we look at their risk factor more scrupulously. But cases like this are quite scary for the disability sector, because I've spoken to advocates who are really worried about families with severely disabled or autistic children who might have quite severe behavioural issues, and they're worried what might happen to them as they get older and if they come into contact with the law.
If they go around breaking windows and suddenly they're not in court.
Yeah, or any past grievances or issues might be held against them. They're really worried about the future of kids. And then IHC, which was also presented their case at the Supreme Court hearing, they made a really interesting point. Their lawyer said that he worried there could be lawyers out there today or in the future who had clients with an intellectual disability that would try their utmost to persuade the court that their client was not intellectually disabled and shouldn't be applied under this Act, and push them through the criminal justice system, even though going to prison could be the worst thing for them, but at least there would be an end date in sight, rather than go through this alternative system where they potentially could be held indefinitely.
So how many people in New Zealand right now are in the same situation as Jay?
There are about 100 to 120 people who are held under the Act at any one time. About 30 people are held in secure hospital level care. About 10% of the people under the Act at any one time have been under the Act for longer than 10 years. So Jay's one of those 10%. But because it's such a small population, it's hard to get the actual figures because of privacy issues. So yes, there are people who this is their everyday experience.
Human rights lawyer Tony Ellis has for the last 8 years been helping Jay's mum challenge the care orders made over her son. He's working pro bono.
He's been working very hard to try and challenge these orders. This is a case he's kept on it because he told me it's so important to him. He said to me something like, this guy has lost his best years of his life. He's been locked up, all because he's intellectually disabled. His argument is that he's been severely discriminated against here, because the law is discriminatory. Because if you were not intellectually disabled, you would have a very different pathway.
The question of protecting the community versus the disabled person's rights, I feel like we haven't got the balance right.
This is Dane Dugan, who's the Chief Executive of Autism New Zealand.
The balance must be struck, but it seems like the disabled person is too often sacrificed, and sometimes that's due to a lack of understanding, fear, or a lack of resources. Also sometimes from an unwillingness to see the world from their perspective. So yes, there has to be a balance. We totally get that. Public safety is obviously paramount. Public have to be kept safe, but there's got to be a balance where the disabled person's rights are also upheld, which means there needs to be a better outcome for these people than what we're seeing now.
Dane's been keeping track of this case but isn't involved in it. But he has advocated for autistic people in similar circumstances to Jay.
We do know that there's a lot of these similar type cases around where the system's just not designed for our autistic community at all, and makes it really, really difficult to get the right sort of outcome for our guys, because people focus in this case, the potential risk rather than the underlying autistic traits that could possibly be supported differently and create a different outcome.
Is there a definite lack of training in this sphere as to what autism and all it involves? Because I know, everyone wants to have autism now, eh? They want to be on the spectrum, but, we're not talking about cute little quirks or...
No, so that's an interesting point. Yes, it's a very interesting point. So we use the term now circle of need, and the circle of need is very wide. So in some cases, some people with the right sort of light touch support can go on to live the life that they want to live. But there's still going to be people who are diagnosed as autistic who will need 24/7 care for the rest of their lives. So I think that's where that misconception kind of comes from, because it is such a different need for each person and it's very individualized. So to answer your question directly, only this week, and we know this is an issue, and it's been an issue brewing for quite some time, we get contacted regularly from mental health support providers who don't understand how best to interact with our autistic community. So they're calling us desperate for support and training, as they can see that there's a massive need for autism-specific mental health and wellbeing support, but they just don't have the skills to do it, and they're trying to do their best, but they just don't, and there's no funding provision for it. So it leads to these type of situations where a lot of our people can then be put into seclusion or restraints, which then in turn leads to more challenging behaviour and outbursts. So if we can get these right, we can create a far different outcome for these people, and then in turn a far different outcome for society as well.
So what is missing when it comes to healthcare and funding in the sphere of severe autism, people like Jay?
The big issue with our community, or one of the issues with our community, is autism doesn't fit neatly within any government department. So it does go across every single government department in this country, essentially. So there needs to be a whole systemic change model, really, where from the start of someone's life, we put in place the right supports around them to live a good life and whatever their good life looks like for them. It's chronically underfunded and it lacks support, whether that be in a schooling system or in a work environment or just in the general public. It's chronically underfunded. So we've got a model where we know that if we can get it right early for these kids, that a lot of the children, it's a whole different trajectory for their life if we get it right early. And autistic traits start to show as early as 12 months. And there's tools out there that are extremely accurate in picking up these children at 12 months. Then if we can diagnose them quicker, then if we can get their needs assessed quicker and have some early support for them, their life can be significantly different than what it possibly could be if we don't pick them up early. And that's really, really important to note, I think, that there has to be systemic change. Now, that's looking ahead into the future. In terms of the Jays of this world, I think it's understanding what his needs actually are, what those autistic traits looks like, and how we can better support them and get that into a community environment where he's not isolated and locked away and he has the right supports around him.
I mean, you talk about systemic change, that needs understanding, but it also needs money, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's chronically underfunded, absolutely. This government's pretty big on social impact and social investment, and we know if we get it right early, not only will it create a better quality of life for that person, that the supports they're going to need as they get into school and then as they get into adulthood is going to be significantly less than what it is now. And if we get that right early, there could be some significant financial, and I'm really hesitant to put a figure on our community. It's a really hard thing to do, but the reality is we do need to do that in order to make change. And for a smaller investment early, we will save significant amount of money down the track.
In terms of people not being locked up anywhere?
In terms of people not being locked up, in terms of that different trajectory for people, so they may get a job, which means they're paying taxes, which means they're off the government benefits and whatnot, all these other good things that come with getting the right supports early for these people. Now, for those who need 24/7 care, there's always going to be a care component for those people. But again, if we get it right, we share the burden of that support across a few of them in the same sort of community environment, whether that be in a housing environment or whether that be in some other type of environment. Again, we can create more economies of scale in that space because we get it right early, we support them early. Their support needs will likely be less as they go on in life, as we help that need early on in their life and support that need early on in their life.
Do you know if Jay's case is extreme, 20 years, a lot of it in isolation.
Yeah.
Do you know if there are any other people in his situation?
I've been in the role for about 10 years and I've probably heard of 3 or 4 that have gone through this over that period of time, and that's 3 or 4 too many. It really comes down to, rather than looking at the compulsory care order, there should be a limit on it, but there also needs to be a way to ensure that we are supporting that person's needs better, so then we can actually create a different outcome for that person rather than having that compulsory care order extended 11 times over 18 years. And it does seem to be that it is an arbitrary extension. So I think in general, if you had a process where in 3 years' time there had to be a complete assessment again or a whole different change of environment, or getting experts in, not just the people who are assessing these people in terms of their immediate risk to the community, but also looking at what their autism actually looks like, or their other disability, not just necessarily autism, but autism in this case, what that looks like and how we can support that person differently. Because we know of cases where people have been put in isolation for many years, and part of the issue was they were directly outside a construction site, and that construction site was going on for years and years and years, and the noise really had an impact on that person's behaviour. Whereas moving that person out of that particular setting and getting the right environment for them created a whole different outcome for that person. So there are some simple things we can come in, or experts can come in and look at. I'm not suggesting it's that easy in this case necessarily, but that's the starting point. Is it the right environment for this person? Are there sensory overloads? Are there other issues that are causing these sort of challenging behaviours or outbursts? And then how do we look to address the underlying issues rather than the behaviours itself?
We're coming up to the 2-year anniversary of Ashley being in the community. He's got his own space. She loves his own garden.
Every morning I get up and do some gardening.
Ashley's changed in the fact that he's settling into his own space, that he can sit and relax and stare out his room and see the bush and watch the birds. He's becoming happier at being himself.
Is Ashley Peacock's case a factor, or has it been a reference in this case?
It did come up. It was mentioned by the Human Rights Commission, just as an example of what could happen when you gave someone their own environment that suited them.
What sort of environment would suit Jay?
So talking to his mum and going back to when I went to see her at her home, she showed me a whole pile of letters he'd written over the years, and he talked about his ideal home, just like Ashley. And his ideal home is living with his mum, which he called his number one house. Now, his mum would dearly love him to live with her. I don't know whether that's possible, given his challenges, but I think ideally she would love for him to be in a more community-minded facility where he would have more freedoms, more access to programs, be able to go on outings, and where she would actually be able to visit him. In previous facilities, she has actually gone every day to visit him. She told me once that there was a facility that was quite near where she lived, and she would go and tuck him to bed every evening, just to be part of his daily care. The last 4 years while he's been at the Mason Clinic, she's never seen his bedroom. She's not allowed into the area where he's kept. She only sees him once a week in an adjacent visiting room. And she's not allowed to take her phone or any recording device.
So she's got no pictures of him?
She's got no pictures of him. She just wants to be involved in her life. She just thinks that if she was able to help care for him, he would be so much happier.
But in Jay's case, experts have judged that he poses a risk to the public that outweighs his right to freedom. The Crown's used case law from 2011 to argue this point.
Since then, Jay's advocates have argued that, well, we've moved on in the world. Our international human rights and disability obligations have moved on. International human rights standards have moved on. While there is risk, we also really need to think about a person's liberty as well. And since that piece of case law, New Zealand has signed or become a signatory to the International Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, which says that everyone has the right to live in the community and to have equal access to justice, and it's argued that people like Jay don't under this law. And this was brought up in the Supreme Court hearing, which was really interesting. What is risk? How do you define that risk? And Chief Justice Winkelman actually said, well, in the criminal justice system, if someone is held on preventative detention, which is essentially what this is, you really have a very high benchmark for that risk. That is high risk of serious violent or sexual offending. Whereas under the Intellectual Disability Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act, it appears to be that it's just any risk. And she actually questioned, well, what is the risk of Jay reoffending here? Is it him smashing windows again? Is it violent offending? He has no history of violent, serious offending.
So all this talk about him wanting to cut people's feet off is probably just talk? Maybe
we don't know. These are, I guess, specialist assessors who their job is to assess the risk. And you can understand why they're being cautious, because if someone's saying they want to seriously harm people or cut people's feet off or kill someone, imagine setting them free and what would happen if they did that, and that would land hugely on them. You want to protect the public, and people, I guess, take a cautious approach, don't they?
If the Supreme Court rules against Jay's release, Tony Ellis plans to take the case to the United Nations, which Anusha says has been telling New Zealand governments for years that the law under which Jay is held is not up to human rights standards and needs to be changed.
I think this raises some questions about how we treat disability generally in our society, and the view is that perhaps New Zealand is a bit behind the times.
That's it for today. The Detail is supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Sharon Brett-Kelly. Thanks to Anusha Bradley and Dane Dugan. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite anō.